9 months ago, I recognized that time was an important issue for climate change, but started to organize an effort to try to get people to develop a plan to address the threat of climate change. And then the pandemic hit. We had actually scheduled to have a meeting here in Elk, bringing the people together. We had to change that. But what I didn't anticipate was that the pandemic itself was had a very powerful impact on what we're doing. And it's hard to describe this, but what I really, the way I say it to myself is, I really lacked the imagination of what a catastrophic event could do to ourselves. It was one thing to have it in my brain and hear about rising sea levels and changing storms and all that stuff. But to see the pandemic totally bring the economy of the globe to a standstill and see the enormous amount of death it could cause made me realize that I totally underestimated the nature of the threat we faced. And in particular, the crucial thing we learned from the pandemic is that you've got to anticipate it before it happens. You've got to act way before it happens. Because if you get into the motion where the number of contaminated people is greater than 1.2 for every sick person, you go into exponential growth and the thing runs away. And so you gotta make steps to make sure you stay below the threshold of exponential growth. And I realized right away that there's an analogy to that in the climate thing, the so-called tipping points. That is, if we go above 450, in the case of climate change, 450 parts per million, and some people say it's even lower, that will initiate a series of catastrophic releases of CO2, potentially, like the CO2 stored in the peat moss in the Arctic or deep in the ocean. And those catastrophic releases can raise the temperature in a very short period of time and then further stimulate additional catastrophic releases, much like a pandemic. And so what has happened is that I now recognize there's a complete analogy, just different time scales, between the pandemic and the threat of climate change. And they have the characteristics that you've got to get in there before it reaches its exponential growth rate. But I recognize something else, right? We could not respond to the pandemic by using the normal mechanisms that we have for other emergencies we've encountered in the past, right? You need a global cooperative effort. The companies developing a vaccine have to work together, right? And so that made me recognize also that we have to mobilize to address the threat of climate change. We have to bring industries together to cooperate so we can address this threat in a timely fashion. We have to go about doing things in ways that we have not done, but we have to do it before not done in addressing other opportunities or threats we face. Maybe the closest thing was in World War II, where we had to build so many ships in a short period of time, right? And so the normal way they did it wouldn't work, so you had to really find a way to really accelerate the rate. But what I also recognized is that we found a way, if we can use the carbon we remove from the CO2 to address the threat of climate change and use it in our economy, we can build in a positive feedback loop that is itself exponential. And so we can, instead of having a linear response, by using the carbon that we take from the sky that reduces the threat to keep it below 450 and preventing us of CO2, but storing it in our economy, in our fuel, in our cement, in our carbon fiber, in our buildings of construction, that by doing that way, we generate wealth, we generate jobs, and that creates more demand and more ability to store it. And so we not only have to start early, but this approach of having to mobilize and take advantage of positive feedbacks so that you'll get an exponential solution, right? An analogy with the pandemic, how fast can you distribute all the gowns and all the stuff to the system so it's prepared for the oncoming onslaught of patients, right? And so in fact, this pandemic has really been a lesson and for all of us, I think, in bringing, which was always one of the problems. How do you imagine something as catastrophic as this that you've never experienced in your life, that you have no emotion? It's just a dry piece of fact, right? And now it's become an emotional reality for all of us. And I'm not the only one who's feeling this. You can see in the literature more and more calls for people to recognize that there's a lesson from the pandemic, and that we have to apply that lesson to climate change. And what I'm saying is that's certainly true, but in addition to that, the lesson we have to also bring is that we really have to mobilize to do that. We can't do it as business as usual.